When the government officially labels a group, especially a decentralized activist group, a domestic terrorist organization, well, things get intense, fast. The implications are huge, way beyond just the politics. So we really need to cut through the noise today. Our mission in this deep dive is to get into the sources, the details surrounding that official move. The Trump administration designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist group. We're going to unpack the actual declaration, the administrative plan that followed, and importantly, the claims used to justify what seems like a pretty unprecedented federal response.
Exactly. And we're focusing today on synthesizing the details from one specific White House event. It was a roundtable discussion specifically about this declaration and what they plan to do next. For you, the listener, it's crucial to understand not just what was announced, but the immediate administrative weight, the power from the very top levels of government thrown behind this.
Okay, let's set the scene then. Where and when did this happen? Our sources pinned this down to a White House roundtable on October 8th, 2025. And this wasn't like a standard press briefing, was it? It feels much more strategic, like launching a whole new policy direction.
Oh, absolutely. And look who was there. That tells you a lot. Obviously, President Trump led it. But the cabinet members present really signaled this was meant as a coordinated, whole-of-government kind of approach. We had Attorney General Pam Bondi, FBI Director Kash Patel, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio all there. Plus, some independent journalists were invited too, sort of to witness it all.
Bondi, Patel, Rubio. So the Attorney General, the FBI Director, the Secretary of State. That lineup itself tells a story, doesn't it? You've got federal prosecution, domestic intelligence, and foreign policy, all represented in that one room.
Precisely. It signals the intended scope right from the start. And the stated reason for gathering them. Well, according to the source material, it was explicitly to address Antifa's violence. They specifically highlighted activity in Portland, Oregon, as the main concern driving this need for action.
Right. And it all led up to the main event, the core announcement from President Trump. Antifa's formal designation as a domestic terrorist organization. Okay, maybe unpack this for the listener. Why does that formal designation matter so much? What does that label actually unlock for the agencies involved, operationally speaking?
Well, it's a significant shift, especially for the FBI and the Justice Department. Now, a domestic designation doesn't automatically carry all the same legal weight as a foreign one, that's true, but it immediately bumps the group way up the priority list for investigation. It means federal resources, things like surveillance, intelligence gathering, applying for warrants, can all be focused much more intensely. Essentially, they stop treating it maybe like a series of local protests and start viewing it as a national security threat. It fundamentally changes the bandwidth dedicated to tracking them.
Okay, so it's designated. But the administration didn't just, issue a press release and walk away. They immediately rolled out specific forward-looking actions. This was the launch of a plan touching both home and abroad.
That's right. And that's where Secretary of State Marco Rubio's role becomes really interesting. He was specifically directed to look into a foreign terrorist classification for Antifa. Now, that raises some big operational and frankly legal questions about how the administration sees this group. Does it have international reach in their view?
Wait, a foreign designation? For a group generally seen as decentralized and, mostly operating domestically within the U.S., how would the State Department even justify that? That seems unusual, to say the least, for a group mainly involved in U.S. political issues.
It is unusual, and the sources suggest the administration's angle relies on perceived international links, maybe funding streams, which actually we should get into in a moment. But sticking with the immediate actions back on the domestic side, Attorney General Pam Bondi laid out a very clear interagency plan. It involved comprehensive cooperation across agencies, specifically designed, in her words, to dismantle the group.
Dismantle the group. And this is where the language they used gets really, really telling about the intended approach, isn't it?
Exactly. Bondi's outline specifically mentioned using methods to dismantle the group that were akin to cartels. Let's just pause on that phrase for a second. Akin to cartels. That's a huge clue about the playbook they intend to use. When federal law enforcement goes after cartels, they often bring out the heavy hitters, statutes like RICO.
ICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. So, using the cartel analogy suggests they're not just looking at individual arrests for, say, property damage or assault. They're aiming higher, trying to prove a pattern of criminal activity, targeting the structure itself like you would with organized crime.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
But isn't that a massive legal challenge with a decentralized group? applying an IPO.
Absolutely. It's legally very complex. Traditional cartels usually have clear hierarchies, financial motives like drug trafficking or money laundering, a structure aimed at profit. Trying to apply those same powerful, complex tools to a looser network of activists who share an ideology but maybe aren't centrally organized for financial crime, well, that's a significant legal stretch. But the source material makes it clear the administration seems prepared to make that attempt. That comparison, akin to cartels, wasn't accidental. It frames their whole strategy.
Wow. Okay, treating a domestic political movement like an international drug cartel, that demands some serious justification. So let's pivot to that. What was the rationale? What evidence did they actually present at this roundtable to back up the designation and these, frankly, pretty aggressive new plans?
Well, a lot of the justifications seem to center on the alleged scale of the money involved. The discussion included figures suggesting over $100 million in funding somehow connected to the group's activities. Now, presenting a number that large, whether accurate or not, allows the administration to argue this isn't just, small-scale unrest. It paints a picture of a sophisticated, well-funded operation.
Over $100 million. And did they name names? Did they specify where this funding was supposedly coming from?
They did. The source material is very specific here. They explicitly cited George Soros's Open Society Foundations. Naming a major, very well-known philanthropic organization like that, it really puts the alleged financial network front and center in their narrative.
Right. It focuses the blame, or at least the alleged source of support.
It definitely helps anchor their justification narrative. It shifts the focus maybe from just individuals protesting on the street to this idea of centralized big money backing. And this focus on funding ties directly back to that cartel comparison and the enforcement strategy they talked about, mapping the financial networks.
Okay, but how easy is it really to map financial networks for a group that's famously decentralized, where membership is fluid, actions can be spontaneous? Did the sources give any hint about how the FBI planned to tackle that challenge, following the money in a structure like that?
Well, the sources suggest the strategy wasn't necessarily about tracking every single small donation or every individual involved. It seemed more focused on those alleged large, possibly centralized funding pipelines, hence the $100 million figure and naming the Open Society Foundations. The discussion apparently included some details on specific FBI efforts already underway to map these financial networks. So the goal seems less about prosecuting individual protesters for minor offenses and more about finding and cutting off what the administration sees as the organizational and financial lifeline for the broader network.
That makes a certain kind of strategic sense, I suppose. If you're treating them like a cartel, you go after the perceived money flow, the top levels, not just the street level stuff.
Yeah.
Now, alongside the financial claims and these network mapping plans, there was also a more direct human element cited at the roundtable, right?
Right.
Yes, that's an important point. The source material notes that the independent journalists who were invited weren't just passive observers. They apparently actively contributed to the justification narrative by sharing personal accounts of assaults they said they had experienced, allegedly at the hands of Antifa-linked individuals. This provided a kind of immediate, visceral justification for the administration's planned actions, connecting the alleged financial network and ideology to tangible, real-world violence.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together for you, the listener. We've covered three really significant administrative moves announced at this White House roundtable. First, the formal domestic terrorist designation itself. Second, this quite surprising directive to explore a foreign classification via the State Department. And third, the stated plan to actively dismantle the group using strategies explicitly compared to those used against international cartels.
Yeah, and if you step back and look at the bigger picture here, what the source material really shows is, well, an unparalleled escalation in how the administration decided to approach a domestic political group. I mean, historically, using these kinds of tools and this kind of language, especially that akin to cartels comparison, it signals a really dramatic shift. It moves beyond typical law enforcement for protests or political disagreements and applies tactics usually reserved for, well, major transnational threats. It basically puts the response on a near wartime footing against a domestic entity.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to think about after this deep dive. Given this stated plan mapping financial networks, dismantling the group like a cartel, what specific legal hurdles need to be overcome? Or maybe what new interagency powers or legal precedents would need to be established to successfully apply those powerful, traditionally foreign-focused countercrime strategies, like ICO or even sanctions, to a decentralized domestic organization, especially one whose main connection seems ideological, not necessarily financial in the traditional organized crime sense. That's the really complex legal and operational challenge that spins out from this administrative declaration.